The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Informed decision-making requires reliable, factual information. That's especially true when science comes through with lightning speed. So tonight we'll get the goods and do some myth-busting around the science of COVID-19 vaccines. Then, Nam Kiwanuka talks to Dr. Jen Gunter about her new book that's got the straight goods on women's midlife health, and in particular, menopause. It's Tuesday, June the 1st, and that's ahead on the agenda. Canadians are flocking to clinics and pharmacies to get their COVID-19 vaccines, but some may be hesitant or even reluctant because they're still just not sure about the science. With us now to help clear up lingering questions about the safety and reliability of these new vaccines, in Bethesda, Maryland, Dr. Nicole Lurie, primary care physician and director of the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations in the United States. And Dr. Lurie, we're delighted to have you on TVO tonight. How's things by you right now?
It's great to be with you. Things are great. I think, at least in the US, we're making good progress on the vaccine confidence issues, although obviously there's a good way still to go.
Indeed. Well, I wanted to start actually with where you are right now. You're just in the shadow of Washington, D.C. What's uptake been like in D.C. as it relates to the vaccines on option?
Well, I think uptake continues to be steady, as I think has been the case just about everywhere. People who are better educated and largely people who are white have gotten themselves vaccinated long before other populations. But we're really starting to see much more spread of vaccination across all income groups and across all race and ethnic groups. One piece of that that's been more difficult, I think, has still been in rural areas. But I think as we're getting more and more experience with the vaccine, people are becoming more confident.
Well, let me hit the race area first, because, of course, Washington, D.C. is 90+% African American. And if there is vaccine hesitancy in that community, what different approaches do you need to take in order to ensure a better uptake?
Well, I think we've really all come to understand that we need to meet people where they are. And you know, I practice medicine actually in a community clinic in DC, and so I work with a very diverse population all the time. And I think what's really important to understand is that different populations have really different kinds of concerns, and everybody's got a lot of questions. And so lecturing at people and saying, hey, this vaccine is safe is not a very workable proposition. But talking to people about what are their worries and concerns and taking the time to answer their questions is really, really important. It's also critical for them to hear from people they know and people they trust. Again, not lecturing, but listening and explaining.
It's interesting that you say not lecturing and not sort of berating people to take the vaccine. And I mean, not just on social media, but I see plenty of it actually in just regular everyday life where, you know, somebody might be walking by the sidewalk without a mask on and they get upbraided. How do we get around that? I mean, the reality is there are a lot of people who are angry right now when they hear about people who don't want to take vaccines. I see right now in the elementary schools of the province I'm coming to you from, the average uptake is 70%. Among teachers, it's 40%. If sort of beating people over the head isn't the way to do it, what's a better way?
Well, I think understanding what the reasons are that people feel hesitant is really, really important. And I can tell you just from talking to my patients, I hear lots of different things. So I hear the most common thing, this was developed so fast, I think they cut corners. And as somebody who's been involved in vaccine development for a long time, one of the things that I share with them is that although it seems as though the mRNA vaccines, for example, were developed in under a year, and that's the story we tell each other in the voice track, that in fact, we've been working on mRNA vaccines for over a decade. And it's taken well over a decade of investment to test the different ways to make them, to test their safety, to test the lipids they've been in, to really optimize things for us to feel ready to go with them. And that the goal of them was ultimately that we could have what we would call a platform or a cassette that you could sort of plug and play if a new bug showed up. And it's only now that this was possible. If this pandemic had happened 5 years ago or even 3 years ago, we would not have been able to do this. So when people hear that and then get walked through, for example, the testing process, that's pretty helpful. And when you can share with people now that the number of hundreds of millions of people who have now gotten vaccine, right, around the country and around the world, I mean, that's really, really impressive. And just be really forthright with them about what we know and what we still don't know.
Let me follow up with you on this issue of the vaccines being developed, quote unquote, at warp speed. And here's something from the Journal of American Medicine that came out last year. For scientists and physicians, the term warp speed should trigger concern. Good science requires rigor, discipline, and deliberate caution. Any medical therapy approved for public use in the absence of extensive safeguards has the potential to cause harm, not only for COVID-19 prevention efforts and vaccine recipients, but also for public trust in vaccination efforts worldwide. That was an admonition put on the record about a year ago. I take your point, what you just said about why things were developed so quickly, but let's hit this right on the head. Do you think there were any shortcuts taken in the development of the vaccines?
Well, I can talk to you about the shortcuts pretty easily. I don't think there were any real shortcuts. The vaccines went through animal testing. They went through phase 1. They went through phase 2. They went through extensive phase 3 testing, in up to 40,000 people in randomized trials. And they've continued to undergo testing and evaluation post-authorization with real world evidence. So from those perspectives, I don't think there was any shortcut taken at all. I think what did happen, and it was because everybody was going fast, were two things. One is that some of the required animal testing that had been done repeatedly with a given vaccine platform in the past was allowed to be done in parallel with the phase 1 tests instead of do the animal tests, wait 6 months, or wait for whatever, and then start the phase 1 testing. So the regulators, because they were familiar enough with using mRNA vaccines experimentally for other diseases, allowed some of that to go forward. And that really helped to speed up the process. So I don't think that was a shortcut at all, but I think it helped to speed up the process. The other thing that happened is that we started manufacturing vaccines before we even knew they were going to work, because we knew that the demand for vaccine would be really great afterwards. But we were totally prepared to throw them away if they didn't work. And in fact, I think the whole world was a little surprised and caught off guard by the number of these things that worked and worked well.
All right, let me follow that up with this. We know who the sort of big names in the manufacturing side of this are, the Johnson & Johnson, the Pfizers, Modernas, AstraZenecas, and so on. Are there still major drug manufacturers that are working on vaccines that have yet to get a product to the market, but may yet still do so?
Oh, absolutely there are. There are overall something like 200 candidates in development, and there are a whole number of them now that are either in phase 2 or still in phase 3 trials. Some of those in phase 3 trials have already reported interim results, for example, Novavax. Some have reported, I think just yesterday, the day before, CureVac announced that it had preliminary results. And so we're going to expect to see those hit the market pretty quickly. And behind them are a whole series of vaccines, including what we might call wave 2 or second generation vaccines that might down the road turn out to have some attributes that make them more desirable than the current vaccines. For example, being stable at normal refrigeration.
And why do you think it has taken longer for these other companies to get their product to market than the 4 I mentioned off the top?
Well, some of them had some early missteps, to be really honest, and so had to backtrack. Vaccine development is a risky business. It typically takes about 9 starts to get to a successful vaccine. And delightfully, that hasn't really been the case, but some of them had some early missteps. Some didn't work, and we don't hear about those at all, right? Some didn't have the required funding, and some just were slow or started late or did other sorts of things. And now it's getting harder and harder, as you can imagine, to set up a randomized controlled trial because vaccines are available in many places around the world, and it's not really ethical to do a trial now giving people a placebo in many parts of the world.
I should ask you as well about some of the incentives that some political leaders are offering in order to get people to be open to taking the vaccine who might have been hesitant in the past. You see things like they're offering lottery tickets, or I think the governor of New Jersey is actually paying younger people to go get the vaccine. Does that, generally speaking, that approach, does that work?
So let me work through the telephone here, and I'm sorry about that. So I think what I would say is, the biggest incentives, gosh, apologies. The biggest incentives are to meet people where they are and make it easy for them to get vaccine. Okay. We know a lot now about human behavior. We know about behavioral economics. We know that everything that we can do to sort of nudge somebody toward vaccine is probably good, not only for them, but for the community around them. And so there's a lot of debate over the incentives. It's going to be really interesting to see and understand better which ones work. But we're all really focused now on achieving as high a population coverage as we can, because it's going to help people stay healthy. It's going to take the burden off the healthcare system. It's going to help economies recover. And it's going to help as variants emerge to be protected as a society from those new variants.
We totally get that you are a person in demand. So if the phone rings, that's fine. We'll just keep plowing forward. That's no trouble there. Okay, I want to put another semi-controversial issue on the table for you to talk about as well, and that is the issue around the AstraZeneca shots in a very small number of people that caused blood clots. And obviously that suggests there is a risk in taking the AstraZeneca shot. There is also a risk in not taking the AstraZeneca shot because you could get COVID if you don't take it. Balance those risks for us and tell us which is the bigger risk.
It's a really great question. And I think it depends a lot on who you are, and it depends on what's going on in your community. So it has been the case that in most places, the risk of getting COVID, and hence the risk of either getting blood clots or dying from COVID, is much, much, much higher than the risk of getting one of these very rare side effects from the vaccine. And by the way, I think we're getting better now at coming to an understanding of what those side effects, of what's causing those side effects. And I'm hopeful that we'll be able to do something about it. But what I would say is, if transmission is still pretty high, and if the population coverage in your community is still pretty low, get a shot and be protected. It is a much better risk to do that than to be concerned about what has turned out to be a very rare side effect. If we get to a point down the road, and I think it's still way down the road, and it's pretty far down the road for Canada, where most of the population is covered and there's not that much disease circulating anymore, then the calculus is really different. I think we know right now that the risk-benefit ratio for just about all populations, except for perhaps younger women, is really, really favorable for getting the vaccine, for AstraZeneca. And fortunately, in Canada, as well as in the US, there are also choices that people have.
Well, that does raise the next issue.
I will just say, the rest of the world doesn't have that choice. In the rest of the world, in South America and Latin America and India and parts of Africa, this thing is taking off like wildfire. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, there is no question by any stretch of the imagination that you will save far, far, far more lives with getting vaccinated with the AstraZeneca vaccine, or any vaccine for that matter right now that's on the market, than you will from worrying about an extremely rare side effect.
Okay, that makes sense. So circumstances do matter, and we understand that now. But you did raise another issue there that I should follow up on, and that is the age at which the vaccine works. Do we assume that it's okay regardless of how old you are?
So what we know now is that the mRNA vaccines have been studied down to the age of 12. The J&J vaccine is in trials down that low, and the mRNA vaccines are also now in trials from infancy or age 2 up. They've now got emergency clearance for age 12 and up, and we know the vaccines work really well. In fact, they work just fine. And so we're seeing in high-income countries that we're starting to vaccinate teens and pretty soon children. It's a really interesting question about the effectiveness or efficiency of doing that from a global point of view. If you've got limited doses and you want to stamp out this pandemic and you want to save lives, you really want those doses to go to the people who are at highest risk of dying or having really bad complications, and those are people who are older and people with chronic disease. But do they work? Yes. Quite well.
And just to be clear, anybody under 12 at the moment should not take it then?
They're not authorized yet for people under the age of 12. Those studies are still ongoing, and we expect that probably early fall we'll see the results of those.
Okay. You do hear some funny things out there, and you're the expert, so I want to put them to you. Can taking the vaccine change your DNA?
It's such a great question, and I get asked this all the time for the obvious reasons that it's really confusing to understand what DNA is and what RNA is. So the messenger RNA is not DNA at all. It doesn't even get into the center of the cell, which is where the DNA is. So no, it can't change your DNA. And in fact, the mRNA degrades within a couple days of being injected.
Okay, I'm going to read something else. This is from Alison Meek, who's an associate professor of history, King's University College in London, Ontario, about 2 hours west of from where I am right now. And here's what Alison Meek says. Pandemics and viruses are scary. People get sick and die. Science, when it's not understood, is itself scary. There's a reason why Frankenstein is a horror story. And the ever-changing nature of decoding viruses suggests to some that even the scientists don't understand what they're looking at. This has been made worse by a public health communication strategy that hasn't been particularly clear. Masks aren't necessary? Wear a mask. Wash your food to avoid contamination? Nah, you're good. This is the preferred vaccine, while this one is suspended because of a tiny risk of blood clots. Okay, this opens the door to a bunch of questions about the scientific world and how well it has communicated information around COVID-19 and the vaccines, generally speaking. What's your view on that?
Well, obviously, everybody could have done a lot better. There's no question about that. And what I would say is we've had a really difficult nexus or intersection of science and politics. And to some extent, this is always the case, but the politicization of all of this, I think, has made this much more challenging. I will say as a public health professional, it's your job to make the best decision that you can with the best available science at the time. And when the best available science changes, to communicate with the public and to change the advice. So I don't have any problem at all with the fact that advice has changed over time as we've come to know more. What I do have real problems about is the way that that has been explained to the public, the way the public has been helped to get ready for that. They should expect that science is the way out of this, and we're going to have more answers to questions down the road. And when we do that, we're going to share them with you, and they might provide different answers. And that's a place, I think, where the politics in particular have really gotten in the way of this. And there's been a really all-out effort to really discredit science as a result of that, and that's really unfortunate.
Well, that does speak to a lack of science literacy that I think you'd agree is endemic, if I can use that word, maybe a science illiteracy epidemic within the population. I mean, is that how things like, if you get an injection, there's a possibility that a radio transmitter developed by Bill Gates is going to end up in your system and they're going to be able to monitor for you for the rest of your life? Our science illiteracy contributes to that?
Well, I think that there's a couple things. One is science illiteracy. One is that the public even has a lot of difficulty figuring out when they see something online or in the newspaper what's true and what's not true. And in fact, we just saw a study over the past couple of days about the way people really even overestimate their ability to distinguish real news from fake news. So I'd say science and literacy is part of that, but we also have to acknowledge that there have been really overt campaigns by conspiracy theorists and by others to discredit or to confuse the public and to discredit science. And some of those have been targeted specifically at different minority groups. So for example, at least in this country, a huge amount of campaign aimed at Hispanic Latina populations to tell them that getting vaccinated will interfere with their fertility, for example. Not true. The thing about the microchips, not true. And the last thing I would say is that a bunch of this information is coming very clearly and explicitly from country actors that want to disrupt society, that want to seed communication and distrust, or in some cases might have a competitor vaccine that they also want to try to promote. So all of these things come together to really confuse the public.
You know, it's interesting. I heard an interview the other day on some radio station somewhere, and it took place in the Deep South, your country. It was the doctor who had allowed in, and the patients had allowed in a couple of would-be recipients who had a bunch of questions, and they were, reasonably educated, intelligent people. And this was one of the questions that they asked the doctor. Is there a radio transmitter tracking device in the needle that I need to be concerned about? And to the doctor's great credit, the doctor didn't call them idiots, didn't take that approach at all. Very calmly and methodically explained why that was impossible. That's the right approach, I guess, right?
That is a terrific approach. And there are two parts about that approach, or three, that are really important. First, the doctor listened to the concerns of people. Secondly, he didn't lecture at them. He explained, right? And he ultimately let them make a choice. And he acknowledged that their concerns were really legitimate and needed to be addressed. What I will say is it's really incredibly time-consuming and labor-intensive to do that, one person at a time or two or three people at a time. And that's why we need lots and lots of different people who various segments of the population trust doing that work at this point. It's hard, tedious, slow work. It's really rewarding. I can tell you that in my own clinic, I might spend 20 minutes talking to somebody about their concerns about vaccination before they feel ready or before they say, I want to think about this and I'll come back and see you next week. And almost all of them have come back and gotten vaccinated. But that's what it takes.
I am curious about your track record, though, of the percentage that you take the time to explain and answer all their questions. What percentage do you actually get to take the jab at the end of the day?
I would say about 85% take it then, and another 10% come back the next week. I will say when I started doing this back in January, as vaccines became available, the overwhelming proportion of my patients, or the patients our clinic saw, were not remotely ready to get vaccine. And that's changed dramatically over time as they've been able to come in and discuss it face-to-face with a doctor, as they've seen friends and neighbors get vaccinated with no ill effects, and as they've seen more and more people die, including loved ones, from COVID, and they know they don't want that to happen.
Yeah, let me pick up on that because I mean, this is unprecedented. What we're going through right now. A vaccine that was developed so quickly and has had so much uptake by so many citizens around the world with so few adverse effects. Has that, I mean, that's evidence. Has that evidence, how far do you think it's gone to convince those who are hesitant that this is something you can do?
I think it's gone pretty far. And I think it's helped a ton. I think what I would say is there are some people just really hardcore, no way, no how, I'm getting vaccine, period, end of story. I think it's still the minority of people who haven't gotten vaccinated. But I think for that huge group of people in the middle who still have questions and are still hesitant, helping them understand how many people have gotten it and what we know about side effects and adverse events has been really helpful. So in this country, we don't have AstraZeneca vaccine. We talk about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and well over 7 million doses have been given. And I think there are 6 or 7 reported cases of the problem with the brain clot. And so that's not very many when you consider the number of people who would have died without that vaccine. And that is an enormously safe vaccine. Nothing in life is safe completely, right? Your chance of ending up killed in a car wreck in your life is 1 in 100. So getting a vaccine is certainly a whole lot safer than that.
And now that you raise that, boy, at the risk of sounding self-indulgent here, let me give you my own example. I've had 2 shots of AstraZeneca. First one back in March, second one just a few days ago. First time, knocked me out for the day. Knocked me out. Could not get out of bed, could not open my eyes. Second time, nothing. Can you explain to people why some people will have the kind of reaction I had? Some people will get a sore arm. Other people get nothing. Other people get blood clots in their brains, rather. Why such a wide array of different experiences?
Sure. And I can answer some of your questions, but not all of them. But first of all, congratulations on getting vaccinated. And I'll tell you, when I got my vaccine, my first one gave me a sore arm. My second one knocked me out for 3 days. And I tell my patients that. And I say, be prepared for that. A really big deal is if your employer won't give you time off if you're feeling crummy. And that, with our population right now, is a reason that people are still a little worried about getting vaccinated. But what happens when anything foreign comes into your body is that your body tries to fight it off. You have an immune system, and that immune system kicks into gear and starts working. And so you may have a reaction, a local reaction to the vaccine that is from your immune system generating that inflammation to fight off what's foreign. And then the more systemic reactions may have to do with the fact that your immune system says, hey, this is a foreign thing. I have to build antibodies against it. So if you feel crummy, get sick, have a low-grade fever, even if you're knocked out for 3 days, it means your immune system is working. And I've never felt so happy to feel sick in my whole life. And I'm gratified that at my age, my immune system is still working well. And you should be similarly gratified, even though you look younger than I do. Why it is that people get the blood clots, I think we still don't understand. And I think there's still more exploration and explanation of that needs to happen, but we know that it is exceedingly rare. And we don't think it has to do necessarily with the immune response that makes you feel really crummy, like with a COVID vaccine, but it obviously triggers antibodies to platelets in a very, very, very small number of cases, and that sets off a cascade of problems.
I can't believe how fast the time has gone by. I literally have 10 seconds left to ask one more question, and that is, there are some people with some medical conditions that ought not to take the vaccine. What are those conditions?
It's a great question. I don't know of any medical conditions that means you shouldn't get the vaccine. For some vaccines, if you have a history of anaphylaxis or really severe allergy, we've seen that with the mRNA vaccines, get a different vaccine. But go, with an EpiPen and be prepared in case you need it. But that's extremely rare, and we haven't seen a ton of that since the beginning. Otherwise, I don't know of anybody with any condition that shouldn't get a vaccine. It looks to be really safe in pregnant women and people who are immunosuppressed or have had transplants. It is safe. They might not generate quite the immune response, and it might turn out that they're going to need a 3rd dose. We don't know that yet, but it's safe.
Dr. Nicole Lurie, we thank you so much for spending so much time with us on TVO tonight. We're really grateful.
A pleasure to join you. Thanks so much for asking.
It's as expected as puberty, and unfortunately, it seems even harder for people to talk about menopause. But that's exactly why it's great when Dr. Jen Gunter writes a book and makes it hard not to talk about it. She's done that brilliantly with her new one. It's called The Menopause Manifesto, Own Your Health with Facts and Feminism. And Dr. Jen Gunter joins us now from just north of San Francisco in Mill Valley, California. Hi, welcome back, Dr. Gunter.
Hi, thank you so much for having me back.
As usual, loved this new book. We've got lots of questions to get into. So I wanted to start by reading a passage from your book. It's misogynistic to tie a description for 1/3 or possibly even 1/2 of a woman's life to the function of her uterus and ovaries. We don't define men as they age by obvious physical change in their reproductive function. Yes, the menopause continuum is a marker for an increased risk of heart disease for women, but so is erectile dysfunction for men. In fact, many medical experts consider erectile dysfunction the quote, canary in the coal mine for men's heart health. Now, imagine a world where we said men were in erectopause. Did I say that right? Erectopause? I hope I said that right.
I made the word up, so yes.
Well, I mean, that quotation speaks to the unfairness and gender imbalances that women face, especially later on when they enter menopause. Why is that inequality so universal?
It's amazing to me that we're still here in this time that we are defining women by their biological functions. I mean, it's ovarian and uterine function are just a small part of what makes us up as people, and certainly doesn't, define us. And I think part of it is this is how it's always been done, and it's hard to change things that have always happened one way. But I think it also, medicine reflects society as in general. And if for thousands of years, the worth of being a woman has been distilled to your uterus and ovaries, it's going to sound normal to use these terms.
The title of your book is Menopause Manifesto, Own Your Health with Facts and Feminism. Yes, we need facts, especially in this age of disinformation and misinformation. But why must we use a feminism approach?
Well, I think it's because of this complete inequality in the way that we look at men as they age versus women. Men get distinguished and women get diminished. The complete sort of absence of cultural narrative with women as they age in our society is really significant. As I was on book tour for the Vagina Bible, I would hear questions about menopause over and over again, and women told me they felt lonely, that they felt they had no culture, that they didn't understand why they were here at this point in time. And I think that again, reflects the way society looks at women as they age. And so, to have true equality, we need to be able to speak about everything, but we also need to understand everything. And we also need to look at the lens and the language that we use.
When we do talk about language, I think there's also a culture of silence. I've seen my doctor in my 40s. I've been tested for other things, but my doctor has never had a conversation about me being, entering menopause, or how I should feel if I have signs of menopause. Language matters. You're not the biggest fan of the word menopause. What would be the medical term you might come up for this era in a woman's life? Maybe like reverse puberty?
Well, reverse puberty certainly is a great description for what happens physiologically during the menopause transition. But I think that I prefer the term climacteric, which is actually an older term that was used, and it really just represents phases of life. And it doesn't tie to a specific phase, fertile or not fertile, old or not old. It's just a phase of life. It's kind of an older term. And so I think climacteric is a much nicer term to use. And interestingly, historically, it also applied to men.
Really? How? In what ways?
Well, so everybody had climacteric. We also, looking at sort of like ancient sort of terminology, they viewed health in phases of life. And so, you had this young phase, whatever your teen years. And so, there's sort of these phases where anywhere sort of like 8 to 10 years or sometimes longer, depending on the culture. And so this idea that phases of life existed also applied to men. It wasn't tied to reproductive function, but, it's certainly far less gendered.
There is this culture of science, as I've mentioned, the topics you cover in the book are often the ones that, we whisper over cocktails, vaginal dryness, changes in libido, hot flashes or hot blooms, as you call them, even extreme mood swings. You do write, the one thing predictable about menopause is the unpredictability. Unpredictability aside, with menopause comes the risk of many other health issues that are really important. Like what?
So, in addition to the bothersome symptoms, as you mentioned, so the earlier that you have menopause, the greater the risk of having sort of the complications associated with it. So there's a greater risk of, dementia, of type 2 diabetes, of heart disease, osteoporosis. And obviously there's genetic factors that come into play with that as well. But so those are the medical conditions that are associated. The most common depression can also be triggered during the menopause transition. So that's also another consideration.
I always joke with my husband that as he gets older, he ages like a fine wine, but because I'm a woman, it's kind of like I age like expired milk. And I wanted to show you a clip. It is comedy, but it does say so much about what you write in the book and the worth that women lose as they age. This is from Inside Amy Schumer, and it's called The Last Effable Day.
If you shoot a sex scene the night before your birthday, everyone is like, hurry up, we got to get it before midnight, because they think your vagina is going to turn into a hermit crab.
Well, is there anything you can do to delay it?
Yeah, I mean, you can try, but it only makes it worse. Like those Real Housewives. They try to look young, but then they end up looking like a purse that melted in a car accident.
Yeah.
They look like when a kid draws a face on its hand.
But what about men? Like, who tells men when it's their last day? Honey, men don't have that day.
Never.
I mean, I want to cry, but I want to laugh, but I also want to cry. And that clip speaks to the endings as a woman ages, her last day being desirable. You write about how menopause is actually not an ending for women, but a beginning. And you explain in the book that humans, women especially, are almost the only mammals that get to stick around after the fertile years are over. What is the grandmother hypothesis, and why is that unique to humans?
Yeah. So can I just add one thing though? This idea about, men being virile forever is a patriarchal construct, because that's actually not true. We know that as erectile dysfunction increases, for example, 60% of men age 60 and over have erectile dysfunction. We also know that male fertility decreases with age, but we never hear about that. We only hear about, the stop in fertility for women. Now, obviously we have a harder stop than they do, but the fact that the idea that all men are sort of sexual dynamos capable of impregnating the world until they're 95 is simply not true. So I always just like to get that point out. But what we know from from research is that there's this idea called the grandmother hypothesis, meaning that most animals, with the exception of toothed whales, killer whales being the prime example, die shortly after they finished reproduction. So they reproduce and they die, and that's the circle of life. But humans and killer whales live beyond their reproductive function. And the belief that this may exist is because when people are beyond their reproductive function, they're still useful to the societal structure, to the family collective. They still have worth for evolution. And so if you compare us to chimps, who have very similar ovarian function, and they're our closest living animals, they die shortly after reproduction in their kind of late 40s, early 50s. And there's a lot of data to show that the length a woman lives after her ovarian function has ended, meaning in menopause, she contributed to the family unit. So she provided necessary calories, she helped provide shelter. And there's data that shows that families that had grandmothers living close by were more likely to have more children. And the longer the grandmother lived, the more likely there were to be more children as well. And so it dispels with this notion of women in their 50s and 60s and 70s as being frail and non-contributory, and really says the exact opposite. Evolution needed women after menopause to contribute, to aid in reproduction through indirect methods.
As a society, it just seems so ingrained in us, the value of a woman being based on her age, or, how many children she has. We still have that. I have some friends who've chosen not to have children, but people are like, are you sure? Are you going to change your mind? How do we change something that's been around for centuries to show that women's lives actually has worth beyond the child rearing ages?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, first of all, it's really important to look at something like the grandmother hypothesis and not say, well, that's your only value. And that's just something that tells us, how we got here. That doesn't mean that today, women only have value if they're grandmothers or they're reproducing. I think as once we can start to move away from these terms, like defining people by their reproductive function, that's going to help us move away from holding, using that as some kind of standard. I mean, the reason why that persists in our society is, again, getting back to the misogynistic notion that that's where the value of a woman's worth lies, with reproduction. And, your ovarian function has nothing to do with your value in society. It is simply, part of what makes you on an individual level. But this notion that, I mean, for example, when I was in my 20s, I used to hate when people asked me if I had kids or was going to have kids. Like, that's not anybody's business. And why do you need to know that information? Especially because people don't ask men. And so I think the one thing that I would ask people to do is to always say, would I ask a man that same question? If the answer is no, then maybe you should rethink it.
Amen to that. You say that menopause is about perspective, and you're right that menopause is a lonely time for women. You also write about how when you were researching this book, it was triggering for you to look back on your mom's experience. In what ways?
Yeah, so my mom, like many women in the 70s and 80s, which is when I was, in my teen years, didn't talk about anything to do with reproductive function at all. We were all Barbie dolls down below. There was absolutely no separate structure. And it was very much, no sex please for British type of household. So, I just had known that she had gone through menopause early, because when I got my period, she said I'm past that. And that was it. That's all I knew. And I was able to kind of look back and look at the time in the household when things were very, very challenging. My mother had some, struggled with untreated depression her whole life. And there was this period of 4 or 5 years where things were just, I would say, catastrophically awful in my house. And, that really, I think, coincided with the time when she was likely going through her, her menopause transition. And so, this is someone who, was not getting any kind of support that she needed from a mental health perspective. And then, had this added physiologic change, and she was really suffering from that and had nobody to sort of turn to. And thinking about that, really helped me have more empathy for her, because I really had very little empathy for it, because obviously when you're the person who's being sort of, victimized by the emotional abuse and the physical abuse, you're not really, you're not, prone to be, feeling generous about that. And it certainly doesn't excuse her behavior, but it certainly makes me see it in a different light. And, wow, what if she'd had somebody who had, what if, it had been okay to talk about mental health? And what if she'd actually been screened? And what if she'd actually been treated? She had suffered from severe postpartum depression after I was born. And it sounds like, talking with family, that it was, bordering on, postpartum psychosis. And so all of this went untreated and, became worse during her menopause transition. And, what if she'd had help? It kind of makes me think about that.
And does it make you sad?
Yeah, it does, because you think about then how that was back then, but how many people is that still happening to now? Like how many women are suffering in that same way? I mean, it doesn't make it okay that she suffered, but at some point, it has to end. And here we are in this era of, of supposedly taking mental health seriously, of supposedly taking the concerns of people as they age seriously, supposedly taking the concerns of women as they age seriously, or concerns of women. And yet I'm hearing all the time from women that they're not getting the care. So I think that's part of really my mission, is trying to bridge these communication gaps to figure out, like, why can't we get this information that we have here from A to B? Like, why is that so hard? And it's certainly not the fault of the people who are experiencing it. These are communication gaps in medicine and in education and the way society is structured.
You also write about the fact that the people who have been experiencing these symptoms, going through this, are not the people that are sitting at the table. We talk about representation mattering. We've been talking about it a lot these past few years. When we do talk about this, why is it important to have, women part of this conversation in what happens to women when they do enter menopause?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question, because on one hand, you certainly do not need to have a medical condition to treat it. I mean, otherwise, we wouldn't have oncologists, right? So, but when you have a group of people, half the population, that have basically been systematically excluded from studies, have been misrepresented, have had their symptoms completely dismissed, you can see how lack of representation has had a huge impact. And so, for example, many of us were brought up with, oh, well, how can hot flashes be that bad? From sort of, my generation, or they're just something that's just being hot. And I was like, well, yes and no. I mean, until you've actually had one or been bothered by one, it's going to be hard for you to know actually how bothersome they could be. And the fact that, it's not like reporting concerns about hot flashes is something new. If you look at, reports from 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, the few that exist, they were described back then as being incredibly bothersome as well. So, if you think that a health concern has been dismissed for so long, the only answer can be the lack of representation. And yeah, I mean, it gets back to also like this concept of period cramps, which isn't really related to the menopause discussion, but how many young girls have been told that their period cramps aren't that bad? Well, if nobody in the room's ever actually had a period cramp, we'd actually say, well, actually they can be pretty bad. And did you know that the pressure generated by the uterus during labor is the same as the pressure generated during menstrual cramps? Kind of puts it in perspective. So yeah, I think that, because of how dismissed women have been, it's pretty hard to study it without having women at the table. Anything to do with
I was going to ask you if you had seen those videos of men with a little belt, so they can feel what it feels like for women when they have period cramps. And I think most of them last for like 3 seconds. I'll send it to you.
Yeah. So, this is kind of a theme that I touch on in the book, sort of the carnage of reproduction is borne by half the population. And I don't just mean the trauma of delivery, because for some people it's not actually traumatic. I mean, having menstrual cycles every month. And because if you have menstrual cycles every month, that means some people have very heavy menstrual cycles, or having painful menstrual cycles, or having menstrual diarrhea, or your increased risk of osteoporosis because of menopause, because that estrogen you have to reproduce is now being taken away. If you look at the whole carnage of reproduction, half the population bears it, and that half of the population is paid less. They have a harder time getting their needs met in the doctor's office, and it's unacceptable, and we have to change that.
Well, just to touch on, to build on what you just said, I wanted to read an excerpt from the book where you do go into more detail about that. In the Menopause Manifesto, you write, and there it was, the source of my rage was this reproductive reckoning, the realization that menopause was just one more way that the burden of perpetuating the species is unequally borne by women, and one more way that our biology is weaponized against us. It is the ultimate gaslighting, because it is our biology, from puberty to grave, that literally birthed humanity as we know it. Many women have been conditioned to fear menopause as an expiration date for relevance and as a sign of weakness, only because that is what men thought. In fact, we have this amazing data that tells us menopause is the opposite, a time when historically women contributed great things to society because of their knowledge and their age. I just want to build up on something that you write in there. You say that our biology has been weaponized against us. In what way?
Well, sure. If you have menstrual cramps, you're weak. If you aren't back at work, 4 weeks after you have a baby, there's something wrong with you. If you have mastitis from breastfeeding, you're sort of trying to deal with that and pump or breastfeed and do Zoom meetings for work at home. If you have hot flushes, you're getting your symptoms dismissed, or you're told that you're weaker, or you're told that your concerns don't matter, or you never get screened for osteoporosis because nobody gave a concern to your biology. And so you just started getting fracture after fracture and spent the last 10 years of your life in agony like my mother did. I mean, so, we're held, we're graded, I guess, as lack of a better word, as being weak if we have cramps, if we have heavy periods, if we have hot flushes. Everything in the workplace, everything in the school is designed around people who don't menstruate and people who don't have menopause. And so I think that we just need to take a step back and realize that, having the biological machinery to reproduce, whether you reproduce or not, you're still paying tax on that, right? So even if you have no desire to have kids, you're absolutely none, you're totally great, which is, a lot of people, you're still saddled with the bleeding, you're still saddled with the menstrual diarrhea, you're still saddled with the immune system that increases your risk of having autoimmune conditions. And so this idea that we are the weaker sex and is just, so much more offensive.
Once we do reach menopause, I wanted to talk to you about some ways that we can manage our symptoms. Hormone treatments were popular with many women in menopause, but then I guess they got a bad rap for being harmful. What is the research on that?
Yeah, menopausal hormone therapy. So when I was in training, in my first few years of practice, we gave basically everybody hormones. And a lot of that was really tied to sort of the misogynistic notion that estrogen was the fountain of youth, that that estrogen was tied to femininity, and these were desirable characteristics, right? All viewed through sort of a very narrow cisgendered lens. And so then the Women's Health Initiative came out, and that was a randomized prospective trial that suggested that the hormones were associated with an increased risk of breast cancer and an increased risk of heart disease. And there were many issues with the study, and also many issues how the study was communicated to the public. And after years of sort of teeth gnashing and rehashing the data and looking at things, we now know that for women who start menopausal hormone therapy before the age of 60 or within 10 years of their last period, that this is really a very low risk, about as low risk of treatment as you can have, especially when used for 3 to 5 years, but even longer than that, it's still very low risk. Very helpful for many symptoms. It can also help with depression and can help with prevention of osteoporosis. But there's also other treatments for those things as well. And I think it's great to know that we have a big spectrum of things to offer.
And one of the other treatments that you write about in the book is exercise. And exercise sometimes just seems so simplistic a solution. And it's also very daunting, and you beat yourself up if you don't do it all the way. And in the book, I love that you write that exercise, like money, you will take whatever you can get. But why is exercise something for women to consider?
Yeah, so the 3 biggest things you can do for your menopause are all the non-sexy ones, like not smoking, exercise, and eating healthy, right? So although they should be the sexy ones, we need to rebrand that. So yeah, exercise is money in your bank. I always tell people, no matter what you do, think of it as free money. Sure, would we all like $100,000? Yes, but if somebody just handed you $5, you'd be like, oh, okay, great, you'd be happy. And so any exercise is like that. Exercise reduces the prevalence of almost every condition, and certainly the major ones that are associated with the menopause transition and menopause: osteoporosis, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, loss of muscle mass. All of these things actually can be mitigated with exercise. And for many people, we've been taught to think of exercise as something to control how we look, and that is really the wrong way to look at it. Exercise is if it was a pill, everybody would be taking it. It's a health intervention, and the more we can get people on board earlier, the more people can sort of build their bone bank, protect their heart, help protect themselves against type 2 diabetes. But even like like money, if you start saving when you're 65, that's still better than not. So, it's never too late to start. And for even people who have osteoporosis, as long as they're being followed by, you get clearance from their doctor and being followed by the type of trainer or physical therapist who's familiar with working with osteoporosis, you can see gains. You can slow your loss of muscle mass. You can prevent falls with exercise.
You also write, you come up with another word that I really like, a menopausal. One, what is that? And is it up to each of us individually to come up with our own menopausal?
You cut out right on the word.
I'll ask. You come up with a word that I like, menopausal. Menopausal. So one, what is that? And why is it up to each of us individually to come up with our own menopausal?
Yeah, I think I like that term, menopausal. I think we need to all have one. In a sense that, you think about I think of many health conditions that way, like a puzzle, because it's never one thing. And, some things are the key piece of a puzzle, or they're the corner piece, and some things aren't, and they're different. Each puzzle is different. And so that sort of reflects the uniqueness of me and you and everybody else. But yeah, I don't know, I had some fun inventing some words in this book because I thought, all the words that we use about menopause have been invented by the patriarchy. And so, screw that. I was going to start to come up with something. So yeah, I think menopausal is an interesting term for the menopause transition because it's different for so many people.
Dr. Gunter, as always, thank you so much for being with us tonight. Excellent book as always. I always feel so empowered whenever I read anything that you write. We really do appreciate your time and insights.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really wonderful to chat and catch up again.
That is the agenda for Tuesday, June 1st, 2021. The next Ontario election is just 1 year away. And to give you a head start, tomorrow we'll meet some of the youngest candidates hoping to get your vote. I'm Nam Kiwanuka. Thanks for watching TVO and for joining us online at tvo.org. And Steve, will see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.